Talk Like an Egyptian, a podcast about ancient Egypt with Dr. Chris Naunton and Izzy Lawrence. In this episode, we discuss the history of Egyptology and exactly how the ancient Egyptians captured the Victorian imagination. Hello, everybody, and welcome to, I believe this is going to be our 5th episode of Talk Like an Egyptian. Yeah, 5th.
Gosh, already.
I know, already. Time has flown. To be fair, assuming everything goes to plan, episode 1 and 2 should have been released at the same time. So it's only the 4th week. So we've been doing this months now. And you are I think somewhere in Egypt at the moment, digging around. So
I mightn't I?
Yeah.
Yes.
This is the thing about the future. We're doing this slightly in the past. Obviously, we can't just dream this up and just put it out live, guys. This requires a little bit of editing. When we decided to do this podcast, the evening when we drank beer and decided that this was going to happen was also the evening that we were at the British Museum. And somebody did ask us the question is, why are we so obsessed with ancient Egypt? And I thought that was a really good question because, there are a lot of ancient civilizations and we learn about ancient Egypt. Even in schools, they tend to prioritise it. And so is it a big obsession? I know it is for us, but do you think it is generally?
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, it's a little bit hard being sort of in it and doing it for your job and having done it for my entire adult life. It's easy to think that everyone's obsessed with it. But I think it's true, isn't it? I mean, you're right. School kids do it. And museum galleries with Egyptian things in particular are full, and it's the Egyptian things that people want to go and see. And, if you go to the British Museum, I think I would be right in saying that their special scientific research people have established that people go to the Rosetta Stone more than anything else in the whole collection. And
so much they've got 2, one you can touch.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Exactly. A real one and a fake one, and maybe there's others as well. Who knows? And I'd be willing to bet up to £3 or £4 that more people go into the Egyptian galleries, if only because they're there for the Rosetta Stone, than to the others. Which is not to say that nobody goes to the others, but it's the Egyptian stuff that people really want to see. And this has been the case. This is not new. This has been the case for a long time. And I guess probably, although it is difficult for me to think outside, being an Egyptologist and being not obsessed with it, but very into it. Let's say I can remember, the before time. I, along with lots of other people, were very interested in it and wanted to go to the British Museum and wanted to look. I can remember looking at hieroglyphs in the museum, I think, and thinking, I wonder if I can figure it out. If I just look hard enough, if I think hard enough, I wonder if I'll be able to figure it out. I couldn't.
Funny that.
Good reason for that. Yeah, funny, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, well, once you start actually studying it, you think, oh, yeah.
Even after the Rosetta Stone, it took a couple of decades, I think. So.
Yeah, well, there's still things we don't know. So, so 7-year-old or whatever.
Look harder. Look harder, Chris.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It wasn't just that we had to go home before I figured it out. Yeah. So then the question is why? I think there's lots of different ways we can answer this.
When we were asked this at the British Museum, all I said was, do you know how many French people we had to kill to get our hands on this stuff?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of stake, particularly if you're British or French. There is a lot of sort of national stake in who got Egypt during the Napoleonic Wars and stuff, and who fought who and all the rest of it.
There is a historical dimension to this, for sure. Modern political history dimension to this. We should probably say that, yeah, so, when we say, why is everybody obsessed with it? That might not be the case for everybody everywhere in the world. This might be confined to the West and Europe, or even, as you say, even particularly certain countries in particular, like most obviously Britain and France.
Britain, France and Egypt seem to be the place to go if you want to see good ancient Egyptian stuff. Are there a lot of collections in America or in Australia?
No, there are. There's stuff everywhere, yeah. There came a point in the 19th century where Egypt became fashionable enough for people I still think this is largely the Western sort of world. It became very fashionable to go. Egypt became very fashionable. We still haven't explained why this is, but we'll get there. Collecting was very fashionable, and creating kind of educational collections of things. Well, I suppose collections of things which were either pretty and or educational and gathering them together in these museums, which would be places of great learning and places where people could go and, learn about another culture. But there was also this modern political dimension to this, which is that, a really marvelous collection of very pretty and, edifying objects speaks to the great glory of your nation. So once people start to see that, well, for example, Britain's got a very nice collection of antiquities, or France has got a very nice collection, well, we ought to have a very nice collection in our country too. So actually, Italy, or various bits of Italy, were not very far behind Britain and France at all. It didn't take Germany very long to get involved. Austria, America slightly later, but by the end of the 19th century, and I guess more or less from the beginning of the 20th century, America's probably the single hungriest collector. And so the collections in New York, 2 of them at the Met, one in the Met, one in Brooklyn.
Well, they have their own needle, don't they?
They do, they do. They have the other one. So the Cleopatra's Needle, what we call the Cleopatra's Needle on the Thames Embankment, was one of a pair. The other of the pair is in Central Park in New York. Yeah. So yeah, there are collections everywhere, but I suppose we need to talk about the fact that all this begins in some way, or if there's ever a single moment we didn't use this word then, but in the history of Egyptology where suddenly everything gets going, it's probably the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte and his armies.
Yeah.
And you might think, well, hang on, what's Napoleon and his armies got to do with this? Well, first of all, they were there primarily as part of the colonial expansion around the world that was being undertaken by Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, various other countries. France's great rival was Britain at this time, and Egypt was not only a country that they felt would be useful to them for its resources, but it also allowed them to disrupt the trade route between India and Britain. So it was a really good way for France to stick 2 fingers up at Britain and be a nuisance.
Be geopolitically dominant and
exactly.
Trade.
Yeah,
with our most productive colony, I imagine India was at the time, because of all the
cotton,
keeping Manchester and everywhere else going. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
It's not just tea. Yeah. It's not just tea, guys. It's cotton as well. Yeah.
Napoleon, or somebody on his behalf, had the quite enlightened idea of taking along with the armies a load of artists and scientists who would make a record of what was in the country, a description of the country, description de l'Egypte. And the idea was that they would divide their survey into 3 parts. So there was a survey of the natural environment, there was a survey of the built environment, meaning the modern buildings, or what they call the état moderne, the modern state, and then the ancient buildings. And so they undertook, in the most extraordinarily difficult conditions. First of all, Egypt is a foreign, unknown, and to some extent hostile place. And that's not to say that Egypt was a particularly hostile place, but this is, of course, in the days before EasyJet and airports and Booking.com and everybody having a passport and that sort of stuff. If you went to a foreign part of the world as a foreigner, an uncharted part of the world as Egypt was, then you couldn't expect people to just sort of welcome you with open arms. They were a bit like, well, who the hell are you?
In your big ships.
Difficult place to be.
And your garlic bread.
In your big ships with your funny clothing and your funny voices and your funny accents and your funny food, and you're getting sick and you're bringing disease with you. Thank you very much. And, all that sort of stuff. But these poor, probably introverted, quiet, scholarly, bookish types. I shouldn't be stereotyping, should I? But I imagine at least some of them were probably not your typical sort of soldier type. These artists and scientists were out there trying to do their work of drawing and describing the things that they were finding, not only in a hostile environment, but while a war is going on as well. Shots being fired around them between the Egyptian and the army of Mamluks, which is a particular class of people who are the kind of ruling class in Egypt. Not strictly speaking, the Egyptian people, because the Mamluks were descended from people from elsewhere, but so there's a war going on, and nonetheless they managed to produce this incredible survey, which is a monumental record of the natural environment. Great. The built environment, great. The ancient buildings, particularly interesting to us, of course. And part of what they're doing actually is making it possible for this colonizing that they want to happen. Perhaps the first stage is the military victory, but you need to know how to get around. You need to know how to understand people. You need to know how to make yourself understood. You need to know the customs and practices. So you've got to do all this stuff, actually. So they were laying the groundwork.
You've also got to make sure that the people back home keep funding you. And politically, to show how interesting, you kind of exaggerate how rich and how historically important things are.
True,
is a way to
true.
the chattering classes, keeping them happy to fund, all these ships and men.
Yeah, true. Actually, the British get wind of the fact that the French armies have gone to Egypt, and along with the Ottomans, and Egypt belonged to the Ottoman Empire at this point. There's a sort of coalition of British and Ottoman forces defeat the French, and it takes a couple of years, but eventually the French are ejected. The armies are ejected.
Easy, so easy.
But in fact, the in terms of the long game, the work is done, if you like, because they've opened the door. And so there's now a French presence in Egypt and there's a British presence in Egypt. And people start to realize that there is value in knowing about the ancient stuff and also in the actual stuff itself. So part of the Napoleonic expedition's mission was to carry home antiquities for the glory of the French nation. Those got seized by Britain when the French were defeated. So it's the French that discovered the Rosetta Stone in the fortress at Rosetta, Rashid to give it its Egyptian name. It's the French that discovered that, but it's in the British Museum because it was seized by the British. And there's a
we won it.
Kind of. There's a sarcophagus that's in the British Museum as well, which also came from Alexandria, that part of the very north of Egypt.
I don't know if you saw that, because the Bay of Tapestry, which was almost certainly made by British people after the Norman invasion, is coming to the British Museum. And the French are sort of negotiating all these things where they're trying to say, it's in a special exhibition, so you have to pay and go and see it. So normally the British Museum's free. But the French are just like, we think that French citizens should see it for free. Or how about this? We'll swap you for the Rosetta Stone. And yeah. I'll tell you what, if we give them the Rosetta Stone, they're keeping that. They're not giving that back. There's
terrible,
no
isn't
way.
It? It's terrible. This stuff is still playing out. Terrible. So that's why those things are there, and clearly some people are still unhappy about it. Not least, of course, we should say, not least the Egyptian people,
of course, who it belongs to, guys,
whose stuff was just taken. Yeah. Anyway, that's maybe for a different episode. This also is the trigger for a sudden massive increase in interest in ancient Egypt. So over the course of the following couple of decades, not only is it much more possible for people from Britain and France and elsewhere to go, and to do so with much reduced risk and danger to themselves, because there are now French people there on the ground, or British people, and they have good connections with the ruling elite in Egypt who can sort of say, yes, we'll guarantee your safety. This is a serious, important point. And it means that people can travel around looking at things and looking for things and taking things.
So this is the early 1800s, the sort of early 19th century this is all happening.
Yes, exactly. The invasion took place in 1798 and the armies had gone a few years after that, a couple of years after that. And the country, Egypt, reverts to being part of the Ottoman Empire. But the important thing is that Britain and France in particular now have great influence there. And, you might think Egyptologists are entirely innocent, or people who are interested in archaeology were entirely innocent. But this was all part of a process of making it possible for Europeans to be there and ultimately to exploit Egypt. Anyway, all of this leads to a growing fascination. More and more and more objects are coming back to the British Museum. So you've got a point culminating in this sort of the second and third decades of the 19th century, so into the 1820s, where the leading political figure representing Britain and his counterpart representing France, part of what they were doing, both of them, the French guys, the French representative is actually an Italian guy called Bernardino Trovetti. The British guy is called Henry Salt. Both of them and had an interest in ancient Egypt, and both of them were collecting antiquities. And they started to line people up who could go off and dig things up out of the ground for them, because they realized that not only is there all this fantastic stuff lying around in Egypt, temples and things that you can go and visit, but if you just grub around in the sand a bit, there's loads more buried. Wow. They start to realize this, and this is when excavation work starts to get going. And they start uncovering these very large buildings, but also things like statues. And then once they get into cemeteries and into tombs, there's all this goodies of, brightly painted coffins and mummies and all this kind of stuff. And so Salt and Drovetti are both collecting, but both of them building personal collections, but with a view to eventually selling or passing on their collections to their respective home nations. And in the course of the next sort of 10 or so, 20 years, if I remember rightly, both Salt and Drovetti sell their collections off in three. I think in each case there were three major sales. And in fact, in both cases, it's not, in neither case is it true that their, as it were, museum took everything. So the British Museum didn't take everything from Salt, and the Louvre didn't take everything of Drovetti's, because they were also trying to make money for themselves. So they ended up selling to other collections. But the end result of all of this is that the British Museum collection was suddenly stuffed full of massive things. So if you go to the sculpture gallery in the British Museum now, the biggest stuff there is almost certainly from the collection of most likely Salt, but also I think a few things from Drovetti. Ditto the Louvre. So the biggest things in there will come from this time and from these two collections.
So I'm thinking of things like, if you go to the British Museum, there's like big statues of Ramses II and stuff, which are enormous, huge, and these massive sarcophagi. So it's those sorts of things.
Exactly. So, so the big bust of Ramses II, the sort of head and shoulders of Ramses II, which these days we call the Younger Memnon, that's the kind of colloquial name, was moved by somebody called Belzoni, Italian, but working as the agent of Henry Salt.
These Italians get everywhere. I like this. You've got Italians working for the French, Italians working for the British. I love it.
I mean, the modern, absolutely. Italy in its current form didn't exist at this point. It doesn't come into being until quite a long time after this, of course. But there were two sort of centres of power and influence in what is now Italy, which are very, very influential in early Egyptology. One of them is Turin. One of the most important collections outside Egypt, anywhere in the world, of Egyptian objects is the Museo Egizio in Turin. That's got a lot of Drovetti and Salt type stuff, but also just fantastic, unbelievable collection. The other place is Florence, which was very significant early on, and they have a relatively not so terribly well-known museum. If you go to Florence, it's unlikely that the Egyptian Museum is going to be top of the list for tourists, because there's so many other incredible things to see there, yeah. But actually the collection there is fantastic, and it's almost all these other museums continue collecting for a long time. Florence, not so much. So the Florentine collection, I think I'll be right in saying, is largely that era, but sensational material. What basically happens, to sort of partly add to the explanation here, is that there comes a point where the very largest pieces stop leaving Egypt. That happens quite early on in the 19th century. So it was not okay fairly early on to start removing, for example, the very largest statues. That's why I say if you see a very large statue or a very large piece like the Younger Memnon in the British Museum, you can be pretty sure that it came out of the ground very early on, probably as a result of this. And they were in competition with one another. Not only was it Britain and France, but it was in the person of Drovetti and Salt. They were actively competing against one another, and their agents competing against one another, and the earliest Egyptologists working for the glory of France or for the glory of Britain against one another. And this creates a kind of arms race, which is in some ways to the benefit of Egyptology, because people are dying to understand things better, to collect things. The race to decipher hieroglyphs is also largely a race between British and French scholars. Britain in the person of Thomas Young, and France in the person of Jean-François Champollion, who eventually is the person who cracks the code.
Only because he took copies of the Rosetta Stone. They cheated. They took copies of the Rosetta Stone. That's why it's that colour.
Well, no. But, we should say that eventually there was an animosity between Thomas Young and Champollion, but not to begin with. And in fact, a lot of the scholars who were involved saw past these sort of petty rivalries and were just more interested in the intellectual work. And so there was actually a lot of sharing. There was a lot of free and open sharing of of material like that.
For the science and the history, not the nationalism.
Exactly. Not everybody was completely caught up in the geopolitics.
It's bizarre to me. So much of the 19th century is this newfound nationalism. Like, even things like fairy tales. Because you have, like, countries like Germany, which is just forming, you know, the Brothers Grimm are looking around to sort of try and say, well, look, we've got these stories which are all ours, and we can make a culture out of this, and it's all nonsense. And now we've got, like, the French and the British going, no, Egypt, that's what makes you truly British, having a great Egyptian collection. What?
Yeah.
It's so bizarre to think that all of, what I consider, brilliant things. So I love to read the books and I love to learn about the history, comes out of quite horrible, weird, competitive, bloody exploitation. And it's sad, but it's really important that I think we talk about it, because we have to acknowledge why we know all this stuff.
Yeah, and so I mean, if we think back to where we started in this conversation, why is ancient Egypt so popular? I think this is at least part of the answer. It's as popular as it is and well known and celebrated as it is because people in this country have got the opportunity, thanks to that early colonialism and competition. People in this country, in the UK, have got the opportunity to go to the British Museum, or there are excellent collections elsewhere in the UK as well. And all of this, I think you can trace back to the fact that Britain and France in particular were so influential, not just in terms of archaeology, but politically as well. We should say, cycle forwards towards the end of the 19th century, and I'm really skipping here over things, and I'm not a modern historian, but
Chris, I'm assuming that we're going to get loads of patrons for this podcast, so we're going to have so many opportunities to dive into specifically
excellent.
What happened in 1877, that sort of stuff. Okay. We can do a whole episode.
But I'm just going to very quickly then, and with apologies for skipping over. Although Egypt remains part of the Ottoman Empire, it's kind of subject to British and French influence. And Britain and France both lend Egypt money for modernization. And there comes a point where they want to call the debts in and Egypt can't pay the debts. And as a result of this, massively oversimplifying here, as a result of this, Britain and France essentially take control. Britain as the kind of rather more controlling partner. And in fact, Britain eventually invades. In 1882, there's a bombardment and Britain takes control. Not officially. Officially, Egypt is still kind of part of the Ottoman Empire. And, there's a kind of figurehead, a kind of monarch in position. But really, the strings are all being pulled by Britain and France. And as a result of this, the British take charge of part of the government and the French charge of other parts, including the Antiquities Service. So the bit of the Egyptian government that looks after archaeological sites and monuments and the museum and the collection and all that stuff is referred to as the Service des Antiquités, and it's it's run by the French. The boss is French, etc., etc. And so obviously that makes Egypt in some ways the plaything of certainly not the Egyptians, but Britain and France and other Western nations.
It's like being a stepchild, isn't it? Being torn between two families and having everything sort of controlled, and you're basically punished for stuff that the other parent did. This is not great.
Well, yeah, and control. On a certain level, everything does sort of proceed in an entirely sort of amicable and scientific way. But the people that are really excluded from this are the Egyptians. It's not until the revolution of the 1950s that led to Egypt becoming independent and ruled by one of their own. It's only at that point that the Antiquities Service finally comes under the control of the Egyptian people. But of course, by this point, all these things have left the country, and more importantly than anything else, the science of knowing about ancient Egypt, Egyptology, has come to be established in other places like Britain. And again, it's not just that we have the objects, but we have the expertise, we have the libraries, we have the universities. And it's not to say that Egypt doesn't have expertise in libraries and universities, as well as much, much bigger and better collections, it should be pointed out.
But Britain and France at this point are 100 years ahead in terms of when theirs were established. So,
yeah, exactly.
It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And of course, it costs money to to have teaching positions in universities and to have libraries and maintain libraries, and we're in the privileged position of being able to do that. And so the reason it's an English guy on this podcast talking about ancient Egypt is that it's partly that.
I mean, there's this sort of word that goes around of Egyptomania, and that certainly did, because this wasn't just the elites going, oh, I've got a lovely collection for my museum, this makes me feel so much posher and better than you. This really was, I mean, I remember reading as a kid, I think it's in like a Horrible Histories book, you could go to a live unwrapping of mummies back then. What? I mean, this is just, what?
Yeah, well,
it's really disrespectful.
Yeah, quite aside from the historical context, which I think is important to acknowledge, I think it is also true that there's a certain fascination which I can't really explain. I feel like there's probably psychologists would understand this better. There's a certain gory fascination with preserved human remains, right? Whether that's, I don't know, the body of Lenin that you can go and look at, I think, can't you, in Moscow? Can you do that? I think
so, yeah. That's or Leningrad.
I don't know, bog bodies, or is it Ötzi, I think is the name of that poor guy who died and his body was preserved in the mountains somewhere. This idea of people being sort of frozen in time is an incredibly compelling idea. And Egypt, it turns out, is full of very deliberately preserved and in some cases fantastically well preserved human bodies. And there was this particular sort of scientific fascination and curiosity that seems to have been very prevalent, particularly in Victorian times. And so people, there's also something I should say, I think there's something about things being revealed. And I think archaeology, part of the fascination of archaeology is that there's this idea that things are hidden. So in your back garden, your back garden might look like it's just a lawn and some flowers and a garden shed. But actually, if you dig down, there might be, a Roman villa or something. And that idea that it's hidden and then you find it is also very compelling. And mummies are wrapped. They're wrapped in bandages.
It's being the first as well, which is a very male thing. I did a programme for the BBC about mountaineering and the history of mountaineering. And the idea of scaling a mountain and being the first one is kind of more important than the actual scaling the mountain. It's establishing who was first and who did it first. And the thing when you're unwrapping a mummy or discovering something, you're the first to see it. So it was you.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a very, I don't mean to sort of sound terribly sort of like, feminist stuff, but it's a very male obsession. This thing of being fast and doing things fast is
it could be. And that was very much a Victorian, well, again, I have the sense that was very much a Victorian thing, right? It was sort of about conquering, wasn't it? Like you say, mountains are a really good example. where's the tallest mountain? Find the tallest one and get to the top of it and stand on top of it.
And of course, Victorians are obsessed with death in a way that is kind of fallen out of fashion now. So now we live in a culture which is far more explicit in terms of romance and sexuality and things like that, whereas the Victorians, very into death. They'd cover up their table legs, but they would really go in on funerals. They'd really talk about death in a way that we just don't, and we sort of like try and hide it all the time.
Yeah, maybe.
So maybe this was another way of exploring that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely true that Egypt, and this is maybe something separate again, but I often think that if you sort of mentally cast your eye around the ancient world, and you mentioned at the very top of the episode that, there are lots of other ancient cultures, what is it about Egypt? The most obvious and closest ancient cultures to our own, I suppose, would be the cultures of particularly Rome, because it came here to the UK, and it's the remains are still here, and the influences are still here, and the place names or the language to some extent. And the Roman world was so heavily influenced by the ancient Greek world in terms of, say, monumental architecture. That those two cultures, I often think that those two cultures are almost too familiar to us. There's a lot of neoclassical architecture in this country, to the extent that Greek and Roman monumental architecture almost looks like, well, it's just normal, isn't it? It's not, that's our kind of architecture. Whereas Egypt, by contrast, is something totally different and exotic. Exotic, I think, is the important thing. And at that point, Egypt would have been so new as well as being so different. It's far away, in a way, I think that Greece and Rome weren't. And there were other cultures as well around, so lots of Near Eastern cultures, for example, but Egypt provided a greater abundance of material in a way that those other Near Eastern cultures didn't, and more for people to get their teeth into.
The difference between somewhere like China, of course, is you don't have the connection to it in the way, or indeed India, you don't have the connection to it. Egypt's mentioned in the Bible, and at the time, people are very, very into their religion. They're very Christian, majority of people in the United Kingdom, and here you have places mentioned in the Bible where biblical figures had been, and you've actually got the stuff from that time. So it kind of gives your faith a little bit of a sort of like, look, see, it's real.
Yeah, no, you're right. That was also definitely part of it, I think. There's a great moment there's a BBC kind of docudrama that was made in 1982, which was the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Egypt Exploration Society, which is still going.
Your version of the Bembridge Scholars, which is not the Bembridge
Scholars.
Yeah,
that's right, exactly. My version of the Mummy films, Bembridge Scholars, which is where I used to work. And not the Bembridge Scholars, the EES, I should point out. Bembridge Scholars, fictional, annoying, yes. EES.
Cool.
Real thing, legitimate, very good. So, and the EES was set up as an institution that would go and do archaeological research in Egypt in the late 19th century. And it had its 100th birthday in 1982, and the BBC made 2 films to celebrate this. One was a straightforward documentary about the history of the EES and, early discoveries. The other one was a dramatization of the foundation of it. And it was set up by one of these extraordinary people, Amelia Edwards, who was not a sort of academic, but just somebody with a great passion for ancient Egypt and drive and determination and the skill to raise money to make the whole thing happen and administer it all. And they very cleverly spun what they were going to do in the very earliest years so as to play on the fact that they might be able to go and excavate sites that would help us to reveal the evidence for the biblical narrative, particularly the Exodus. So, according to the Bible, there are lots of Israelites in Egypt who then eventually leave Egypt. They're enslaved and put to work by nasty old Pharaoh, but eventually they leave. Allowing for the kind of foundation of the Israelite
in
people.
A cool way. They part the Red Sea. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. All sorts of amazing stuff happens at the same time. So the EES, Amelia Edwards and co, were saying, we're going to go to that part of Egypt, the north of Egypt, the bit that's closest to Jerusalem and everything else, and we're going to look for where they might have lived. We're going to elucidate the biblical narrative. And there's a bit in the dramatization where they're opening the post and opening all these checks from people who are sending money in to support the work to try and get it off the ground. And one of Amelia Edwards's helpers is sort of saying, another pound. Who's that one from? Oh, it's from Reverend Jones, and whatever. And somebody goes, what a lot of reverends. The idea being, they're all churchmen who are all fantastically interested in, and basically proving what happened in the Bible in the face, of course, of Charles Darwin's "No, there ain't no God, mate. It's all just evolution," which is threatening the church at this point. So the EES play on this, and you're absolutely right that no doubt for people with an interest in the biblical narrative, Egypt is a big part of that. In a way, you're quite right that, say, China, not relevant.
Exactly. Or even India, which is... Because I think modern Britain now, I think we should be way more interested in India, because India is having more and more of an influence on our society and everything else, simply because there are so many of us with an Indian heritage. But in terms of, your culture, where your ideas come from, then back then, ancient Egypt. I mean, even you could argue that the Greeks were getting loads of their ideas from ancient Egypt. All these columns that everybody's obsessed with, where do they see those first?
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, no, and Egypt is very influential. It was a big player in the ancient world. Other ancient cultures which would come to be more dominant were very aware of it. So the Greeks were very aware of it. Herodotus, makes
famously
a big play on it. Alexander the Great was very taken with it. It was very, very spectacular and a big deal. It was a big player in the ancient world, and that you're absolutely right. That had an influence on the Greeks, who in turn have an influence on Rome, who in turn have an influence on us in the Western world.
And if you look at, some of the ideas coming through, like the Bible and everything else, they weren't the first people to come up with a resurrection story. And in fact, one of the first people to come up with a resurrection story is Osiris. I mean, I don't know if that's like the first one ever, but that sort of whole, the basis of the faith of coming back to life after you're dead in a very body literal way is an ancient Egyptian idea more than, I don't know, I'm not aware that the Sumerians or the Akkadians were doing similar things I don't know. Certainly not to the same extent.
No, I don't know either. And but you're right that obviously in the Western tradition that idea of resurrection in Christianity is incredible. I mean, it is the single,
vital,
probably central idea, isn't it? And that certainly is present in Egypt. There are lots of other things. The idea of there being 12 hours in the day and 12 hours in the night, the icon of a kind of mother and child, which in Christianity would be the Virgin Mary and Jesus. I mean, it's not absolutely clear that there's a direct line between Isis and Horus and Mary and Jesus, but those motifs are certainly present, and we could go on and on. There's a long list of these things that were certainly present in Egypt and then certainly present later, whether there's a direct connection or not.
And while we know that, there is no actual evidence of the Exodus story, there is evidence that there were some, I was going to say semantic peoples, and that's wrong, but the people from, to say part of the world, pedantic people coming and living.
Absolute pedants, those people.
But, people who were living, the culture, there was a lot of movement between these different areas, which fed into the different religions that you see coming up in places like Syria, in places like Jerusalem, in places all around the Levant, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably for another of our
when we've done a bit more research on it. Sort of pulling stuff. I read this a few years ago by somebody else.
No, but you were absolutely right. I mean, the likelihood. Oh God, I probably shouldn't go here really, because it just involves too much generalization and simplification and stuff that I don't really know that much about. But the Bible narrative is almost certainly, at least partly, based on genuine historical events.
Yeah,
and some part of that plays out, or quite a lot of that plays out in Egypt, which makes perfect sense because it's in the right place. It's part of that wider world. It's very rich and very powerful. Yeah, and most probably, although it's kind of incumbent on those of us on the scientific side of things, rather than coming at it from the Bible side of things, to sort of say, I'm terribly sorry, but no, there is no evidence for a Joseph or a Moses or whatever. But
there's loads of Moseses in Egypt because it's half an Egyptian name.
The name the name does seem like a Egyptian name. Yeah.
Ra Moses.
And were there lots of people from that part of the world, from the part of the world of the Israelites, as it were, in Egypt? Yes, there is lots of evidence for it.
I don't mean to sound like an apologist, but if you actually read the Bible, the way they describe the way that they make the bricks, the way they describe the way that women give birth between two stones, there's a lot of different things which make you go, somebody who wrote this had definitely heard of ancient Egypt and knew enough about the culture.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that the Bible is true, guys. That is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying there are elements of it which suggest there is historical links that you can definitely make.
I think that's fair.
And that sort of thing, when you're a 19th century person and almost 90% of the country is Christian, obviously Egypt's going to matter to you quite a lot for that reason.
I think you're right,
because it's like a snapshot. It's like a postcard. I've seen a few people, because there's the pictures on the internet of because one of the most beautifully preserved mummies is of Ramses II, and a lot of people believe that this is the Ramses II was Moses's pharaoh, and so so there's lots of people who go and see him, and it's saying, oh my goodness, this is like seeing a character from the Bible in real life, because here he is right in front of you, and that's that sort of thing that you don't get really anywhere else in religious faith so much, because we've stopped keeping gods in temples.
Sorry, just to drag it back to where we were kind of 10 minutes ago.
Yes.
In terms of unwrapping mummies, regardless of what connection there might not be between, say, Ramses II and the Bible, most of those mummy unwrappings that we were talking about, which were an event in Victorian Britain, were not the unwrappings of celebrated historical figures. But it is also true, and I still feel as though I need to just pause myself and just think about this every time I'm thinking about royal mummies. The idea that we've got the actual bodies of these known and actually quite well-known, well-documented historical individuals from thousands of years ago in the past. Not only that, they're not just like a pile of bones. Ramesses II has still got his hair, for goodness sake. I mean, it's absolutely staggering that we can look on these people and Ramesses II, along with all the other royal mummies that we have from that period, had to be unwrapped in Victorian times by Egyptologists. There's lots of controversy about whether or not that was the right thing to do, given that, it was not the intention that he should be unwrapped for the great, benefit of science. But all, we just acknowledge that issue. But it is, I think it's an astonishing thing. And like I say, I kind of feel as though I just have to just stop myself for a moment when I'm thinking about this and just think, we don't have this for any other bit of history, do we? Hardly. You can't go and look at Henry VIII.
He exploded on his way to be buried.
Yes. Yeah, that didn't help. But do you know what I mean? But for this, it's actually that relatively not brief but contained period of Egyptian history where we have almost all of them. We've got not only Ramesses II, but we've got his predecessor and the one before that. His father and grandfather, and we've got his son and successor. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. And so, are these unwrappings, even if the mummy is even if it's somebody named, at the time the unwrapping was taking place, we knew the name, but it's not likely to be somebody that we otherwise know from anywhere else. It's not likely to be a sort of ancient celebrity in that sense. But still, the idea that you're unwrapping not just a pile of bones, a person. We might be, you're in the audience, you think we might be about to look at the face of this person from thousands of years ago. That's a staggeringly compelling thing, I think. If you're that way inclined, it's not for everyone, but for a lot of people, that's an amazingly interesting thing.
And it's particularly in a time where photography wasn't as open to everyone. So we're talking a time when you'd have one photograph taken of you and maybe your family if you were quite wealthy, and the idea of photography now, I can snap a load of shots, but the idea of seeing someone, it's like in person, is even more visceral, and it makes it even more real, I suppose.
That's right.
I still find it very uncomfortable though, because it's the one thing that we know about these people is that they wanted to be left alone. And here we have a load of strangers digging them up, dragging them abroad, and then in front of a huge group of people. It just feels so wrong.
Well, yeah, I know what you mean. And yet, I think you have to balance that against this idea, which I think we mentioned previously, but I think you mentioned in a previous episode, that the Egyptians wanted to be remembered, and they wanted their names to live on.
That is
true. So if this is the whole sort of premise of my book for children about Tutankhamun, is that he was probably pretty annoyed that Howard Carter dug him up, because unlike actually all the other royal mummies, they had been disturbed. So Ramesses II was disturbed in ancient times. He wasn't, lying in eternal rest from the day he died. Exactly, he'd been moved around and knocked about a bit and put in a different coffin, and so he was having a terrible night's sleep anyway. King Tut had been laid to rest and was undisturbed until Carter. But again, you have to sort of think, well, okay, you've been woken from your eternal rest and everything, but you would not be well known at all now if it weren't for the fact that Carter found the tomb. And you could argue that he'd be famous whether Carter and co unwrapped King Tut's mummy or not. And you could argue that it's not actually the mummy that's that important in that. But it definitely is very important, actually, because if it wasn't for that analysis of the mummy, you could do it now with modern methods. You wouldn't need to unwrap the mummy, but in those days you did. It's only thanks to that unwrapping that we know, for example, that he was as young as he was. So that story that, he's the boy king, which we're also familiar with, we only really know thanks to the human remains.
Wow.
So, I think if I ever get the chance to talk to King Tut, I'm going to be interested to know his take on this. I suspect he's actually all right with it. He's actually all right with being famous.
Who knows? I mean, his dad was a bit sort of odd in terms of his religious beliefs. Maybe didn't take it too seriously. We don't know. It was just like, what else?
No, it's actually, confusing.
His dad believed a whole different thing, but we can get onto that. So what we're going to do now, exactly, is we're going to talk for a little bit. So we're going to go away. Thank you so much for listening. We're going to talk for a little bit more about the aesthetics of ancient Egypt and why they became popular.
Oh, yes.
And that sort of thing. We're going to save that for a little bonus. So if you want the bonus, you should either be able to see it in your feed, or if you go to patreon.com/talklikeanegyptian, you'll be able to get that, as well as links to things like Chris's books on, like, you know, an Egyptologist notebook, which covers all of this much better than this podcast does. And you can also get a link to, like, my one book about ancient Egypt, which is largely fictional, but it's based on reality, The Cursed Tomb. Until next week or next time, we're going to leave you with our ancient Egyptian sign-off, and we're going to do it together, and it's going to work like it has every other.
Together by counting in.
I will try and count in.
Okay.
We did a bonus episode where we didn't count in, and it was pretty bad. So let's try and count in.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So 3, 2, 1. Life.
Prosperity. Health.
Absolutely beautiful. I mean, you say it was all right, Chris. I don't think that we'd make very good priests. Thanks for listening to Talk Like an Egyptian. To support the podcast and ensure another series, join us on patreon.com/Talk Like an Egyptian and unlock bonus content. Get in touch, talklikeanegyptianpod@gmail.com, or use the hashtag TLAE. We need your questions for the end of the series, so please don't hold back. Remember to leave us 5 stars of newts and share this episode with your friends. Find all links at talklikeanegyptian.com.